what I would say to that argument is number one, it is never appropriate to say that it's inevitable that someone will kill themselves. That is irresponsible. That's unethical. That's anti human to say that. We all have a potential to live. If you're struggling with mental health, you should never, ever be told, yeah, you will kill yourself if you don't do XYZ. That is completely the opposite of that's just not okay to say that to anyone from a moral standpoint and from a medicinal standpoint.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Laura Becker, who's a detransitioner and author of Surviving the Trans Myth. She has a lot of interesting commentary to say, a lot of useful analysis in the world from art and just interesting takes. So I'm glad to have you here. Welcome.
Thanks, Ron. I'm glad to be here.
So starting off, you had this period of transition in your life. So what was kind of leading up to this idea that you needed to transition?
Well, there's a lot that led up to that. I had a lot of, sorry, there's a motorcycle going by. I had a lot of trauma in my childhood. This should not be a surprise to anyone who has studied anything about transgenderism. When you have disassociation from your body, mind, when there's been abuse, gaslighting in the family, in the home, as a child, you are not going to have a clear perception of reality. You're not going to have a clear perception of who you are. And so my development was coded through trauma, through depression, through suicide ideation. And so my perception of being a female or a male or an adult or a child, everything was skewed. I mean, I didn't have a clear concept of reality. And so I was very vulnerable psychologically and socially to getting influenced by all sorts of negative ideas. And to cope with trauma, I did a lot of different maladaptive coping mechanisms, and pretending to be the opposite sex was one of them.
Were you getting input from people at this time? Were you going to therapy or anything?
So I, like a lot of Gen Z kids, I was placed in the pharmaceutical pipeline pretty early. When I started having social and emotional issues, my parents took me to a psychiatrist at about age 11. And so I was, analyzed, and they attempted to take me to different therapists. And I was actually diagnosed on the autism spectrum when I was 11. And then I was given many different pharmaceuticals, antidepressants, anti-anxiety, birth control. And I saw a couple different therapists, but unfortunately, as you well know, the therapy in the pharmaceutical industries are not always the most useful or accurate. So I was seeing all these providers, but I wasn't getting treated for any of my actual problems. The problems were social and emotional issues from my father, from abuse from my father, and those were not being addressed. And so I was seeing different therapists, psychiatrists, all these people from age 11 until, the age of 15, when I had my first inpatient psych experience, outpatient, intensive outpatient. So it's not like I wasn't getting treated or seeing, it was just low quality treatment. And so at the time when I came out with my gender confusion at about age 15 and 16, I had already experienced really negative relationships with providers and felt like no one understands me. Everyone's just saying I have a chemical imbalance. My parents were, gaslighting me and saying, this is your fault. They were victim blaming me. And I felt like there's just something fundamentally broken about me. And so, oh, here's this trans thing that says this is what's wrong with you if you hate yourself and your body and you don't want to be female. I was like, maybe I'm not inherently broken. Maybe I'm trans. Maybe I'm meant to be the opposite sex. And then I did start to see some providers specifically who specialized in gender dysphoria, but those were also very low quality providers.
What did that look like? You come to them and say, I think I might be trans. Yeah, how did they respond to that?
So I think I was maybe 17 when I started verbalizing to others, hey, I think I'm gender queer. I'm non-binary. I have gender issues. I want to be a gay man. I want to be a trans man. But I also don't know that that's the right path, because ultimately I am female. And that's kind of the whole problem of why I hate myself, is I'm not a man, right? So I had this irrational self-awareness. But when I went to a gender clinic specifically who specialized in trans, this was one of the pioneering gender clinics in the nation. It was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, my hometown. And I went there and they were just kind of like, well, you're valid. They didn't have much to say or analyze. They didn't have much to mirror me in any sort of way that grounded me in deeper reality. They were like, well, you're valid in feeling this way. And then the provider ended up ghosting me and I had to reschedule an appointment and I texted her and she just never spoke to me ever again. I never got a call. I never got a letter. I never got anything. And I was, I believe, a minor at this time. And I felt really, really hurt because I had a lot of trauma around abandonment and
Mm.
rejection. So I was like, okay, like I'm not going to like self advocate right at that time in my life. So that provider was like, okay, affirming and then just being incompetent and negligent. And then the next providers that I was seeing, therapists, I believe they were pretty quality therapists, but they were like, I just don't have any expertise in treating trans. Like I think they were the type of therapists that were like old school, socially progressive, very tolerant, liberal women, and they wanted to be inclusive and they wanted to be helpful, but that social suicidal empathy
Mhm.
overrode their clinical understanding and traditional therapeutic concepts that they could just treat my core issues and help the trans problem, but instead they were like, oh, we can't, I don't know how to handle that, you need to be referred out to a specialist. So sadly, I was seeing decent therapists, but they told me to look elsewhere. So
Mm.
I was like, oh, okay. And then I went through a series of attempting to find a decent gender therapist. And that just is an oxymoron, right? That's not going to happen. So actually, at the time of my transition, I didn't even have a stable therapist relationship. I was seeing only a psychiatrist who actually was the one who diagnosed me with gender dysphoria at, I believe, the age of 19. I came to her and I said, I'm trans. I want to go on hormones. I want to have surgery, but I'm also suicidal and I'm also having a million other problems. And she was like, I've read some about transgender and, I have some books on it. And she gestures to her shelf and she's like, I'll take a look at the literature and, I'll get back to you. The next session, I don't know when it was, it's a psychiatrist. I don't see them all the time. She was like, I've reviewed the literature and it seems like you do meet the criteria for a gender dysphoria diagnosis. So I was pretty much diagnosed off of pretty much
Two,
just my own self-report.
that's 2 sessions, right?
I believe it was 1 or 2 sessions, probably
Wow.
very spread out. And she wasn't even a therapist.
And so, like, it was right after that that you kind of started going the medical route.
Yeah, right after that. So I was very desperately seeking adult help. And so I was reaching out to people that I thought could help me. So at 19, I went to a college professor who was a transgender identified woman. She was a lesbian, a butch lesbian who was identifying as a man. I went to her and I said, I'm really struggling. I'm having all these unrequited loves for gay men. I want to have a penis. I want to be a man. I don't understand what to do. And I want to transition. And she was like, this is her advice. So her advice was, number one, why don't you just wear a strap on? And I was like, well, that's maybe good for being a lesbian, but I'm like a straight person. So I don't, and then, or androsexual. And then number two, her advice was, you can go to this clinic in Chicago where you can get testosterone for free. So I went to an informed consent clinic in Chicago at 19, and I was prescribed hormones that visit. I had only a couple like basic vitals checks. They asked me my pharmaceutical history. I info dumped to them. I told them these are my traumas, whatever. I didn't use the word trauma. I didn't have that concept at the time, but I was like, these are my diagnoses. These are my pills. I was very open. But the sad thing was that they took that as proof that I was trans because in the trans world, it's circular logic. Everything means you're trans because it doesn't really mean anything.
It's impossible, like from that perspective, it would be impossible for there to be a false positive that was caused by trauma.
Basically, yes.
Wow.
Unless you're a detransitioner like me,
Yeah.
and then you were just lying to your providers.
Yes. Okay. It's so you go on the hormones. Like, what does this process of transitioning look like?
So I was prescribed an injection of testosterone at a pretty high dose. And, I'm a 5'2" female, have PCOS, which means that I already have elevated androgen levels in my body. So I already have like hormones that at this time were out of sync. I didn't have regular menstruation my entire life. So I was already hormonally dysregulated, and they were like, just inject testosterone every week with pretty much no supervision and for free. And I was like, that sounds good to me. It's just another drug to it. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm suicidal. So I inject it every week into my thigh, and the process was basically all of the symptoms that I was having already of dysregulation were amplified. So my mood dysregulation became much more severe. I was extremely angry. I was lashing out. I was physically itching to get into a physical fight. Again, I'm a 5'2" female. So I'm like, I want to get into a fight with someone. I was abusing substances at the time. So I was drinking and driving and doing other things. I had increased road rage. I started stealing from stores just for the thrill of it. I got into a car accident. I got into a verbal altercation with a cop, almost got a disorderly conduct ticket, and this was within a couple months. And also within a couple months, I checked myself into an inpatient psych hospital for the third time. And apparently, this didn't trigger any alerts from any of my providers that were assumably pinged by the hospital that I was in there. And when I got out of the hospital, I was like, you know how it is when you go into an inpatient psych hospital, you're like, I'm going to change my life. And then you leave and you don't have any real coping mechanisms and you go back to the same environment.
Yeah,
So you're like,
I've
okay,
been there.
yeah, yeah. So I'm like, well, I need to have top surgery. I need to have my breast cut off. That's what changing my life meant it to me at the time, because that's really what I believed was necessary, as the ideology and the not just the ideology and the cult, but the actual providers themselves, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, WPATH, who sets the standards of care, says that this is what's necessary when you have a gender dysphoria diagnosis. So I scheduled a appointment to have my to have a consultation with a surgeon who specialized in double mastectomy for trans patients. Meanwhile, I had just checked myself in for suicide ideation. So I wasn't in a stable place to consent to anything. And the testosterone was running through my bloodstream. And I became a much more poisonous, toxic version of myself, because everything was being amplified. And so I went to that appointment, and the surgeon, it was about a 15-minute consultation. And the surgeon wrote in his notes, Laura is a very pleasant 20-year-old female who is seeking double mastectomy, and I approve her for this. I mean, and just looking back, it's insane because he knows I'm female. He's calling me a female. He knows that I'm just a troubled young woman who he's going to exploit and just perform this surgery on for money, basically. It's really, really evil to look back on it.
Help me understand, like, is this person going along out of peer pressure, or are they just kind of not thinking? How would you get to that point where you know what's going on and you just kind of continue to sign off on that?
To be honest with him, I don't really know, because he is a cosmetic surgeon. So he's not going to be as trained in humanistic psychology or anything like that, where he's understanding of trauma or anything like that. For a lot of these providers in general, there's, the therapists and I think the therapists, the counselors, the humanitarian type people, they have a little bit of a different angle than the medical providers. So those people I really believe I call them ignorant, well-intentioned leftists. So they're just like, this must be right. This is just like being gay. They're ignorant. Number two, they're leftists, so they're like listening to whatever the mainstream media is saying about it, and they're not questioning it. And if someone's saying, "Oh, that's not healthy," that's like, "Oh, that's just a right-wing bigot talking point." And then number three, they're well-intentioned, which could mean that they actually are genuinely trying to be compassionate, or it could mean that they're narcissistic form of compassion and they have a savior complex, and
Mm.
they really enjoy the power that they have over this very vulnerable population and believe that they're saving them in some twisted way. That psychology I distinguish from the psychology archetype of the medical side of things, which would be like the psychiatrists, the endocrinologists, the pediatricians, the surgeons, right? What we know might have higher levels of sociopathy in that field, surgeons. So for him specifically, this cosmetic surgeon, I'm guessing he's just more on the side where he just doesn't really care. It's more about apathy to him.
Hmm. Wow. Was there anyone in your life at this time that was pushing back at all, saying, I don't know if this is the right path for you to take?
At that time, I didn't have many supports in my life. My couple friends were affirming me. My only providers were affirming me. And then my parents, I had an extremely dysfunctional relationship with my mother and an abusive relationship with my father. So actually, it's interesting. The only person that really pushed back was my father, because my father is just a uneducated, kind of down to earth, normal, besides trauma man. So he's just like, you want to cut your breasts off? Like, what are you doing? But because he was my abuser, I obviously had no respect for him or he was going to have any sort of attention to what he was saying. And also, he was also saying it in an abusive way as well. He would shame me, mock me, and it's interesting, obviously, because the whole reason I had low self esteem in the first place was because of him. So obviously, that's not going to help. And then my mother was worried about it. It's not that she wasn't concerned, it was just that she had been also beaten down by my father and she had this survival mode mentality at that time, and she was just like, well, whatever Laura wants to do. Like, she kind of gave up on parenting me in most ways a long time but previous. She had just kind of given up, and there was a lot of emotional neglect and a lot of just like, I don't know, Laura's just messed up and I don't really know what to do. So she was like, are you sure you don't want to just have a breast reduction? And I was like, no, you don't understand. Like, I need to be a man. I'm not going to have any breasts. So she did have some common sense, but we didn't have any sort of relationship where there was going to be a real conversation or she was going to assert her authority in any sort of way as a parental, but like as a mentor. I should also say there was no resources at this time whatsoever for parents. Like today, there are organizations, there's people talking. Back then, there's absolutely nothing. And this would have been in 2017.
Wow. So you have the procedure, the double mastectomy, and at what point did something start to seem off on that journey?
That's a funny question. I laugh because something seeming off. I mean, my entire life was off. I was suicidal and disassociated. So I didn't have a concept of right or wrong or good or evil. I didn't know anything. I was just trying to get through the day. I experienced a placebo effect from the surgery because I was like, oh, well, I've reached this goal, right? When you're in pursuit of a goal, you're getting dopamine. And then I'm like, oh, well, I've reached this goal. I've done this massive change in my life. I should be transformed now. I'm a very transcendent, self-actualizing, seeking person. So I thought that I was going to self-actualize through this. So I was like, oh, well, I'm getting closer to loving myself and doing all this. So there was a placebo effect. The reality was that it changed nothing, of course, in reality about the how I felt about myself, about the core issues, my behaviors. Things only continued to spiral and get worse and worse because the surgeon had told me to quit testosterone for the procedure, which I wasn't expecting. And I still don't even know if that's standard practice or not. But I quit testosterone cold turkey and I had a mental breakdown. And I ended up doing some abusive behaviors to my friends. And I ended up being disowned by my entire group of friends. So, right after I had the surgery, I lost everyone in my life. I had no one. And I was traumatized by that and had a ton of shame because it was my fault. And so at that point, I was so suicidal over other things. I couldn't even think about the surgery or being trans. And I was so traumatized by the mental breakdown and what I did that I was scared to go back on testosterone, even though I really wanted to. Because this is the reality. I only was on testosterone for 7 months before I had my breast cut off, which is not a very long amount of time. And so the effects from it were not what I wanted, right? I wanted to have a beard, I wanted to have a lower voice, whatever. But I was too scared to go back on. And I was like, all right, let me just try to survive this immense loss of my entire tribe and let me see then about finishing my transition. So for the next 2 years, I existed in this state of limbo where I was even more disassociating, and I was using much harder drugs. I was only associating with very, very broken middle-aged drug addicts and people like that because I had such a sense of shame, and I, couldn't even focus on anything. I mean, I was just surviving, and I was like, well, I want to continue transitioning medically, but for a couple years, I just lived as a gay trans man with no breasts and then some facial hair. Ultimately, I wasn't really passing as a guy that much. It was just a weird liminal state.
Wow. Was there part of you that, I mean, you've start this transition period and it looks like chaos and mental and emotional turmoil in personal relationships. Was there part of you that thought like maybe at the end of this journey somewhere, if I have like a little bit more testosterone or surgery, whatever, the solution is there beyond somewhere over the horizon?
Yeah, I was really hoping that the surgery would make me feel better. I was hoping that I wasn't delusional to the point where I was like, this is going to fix everything. I mean, I still understood I had other problems, but I just felt like I was conditioned to believe I was fundamentally broken and irredeemable, and I was like, well, I was often writing in my journal, like, it doesn't matter if I'm a man or a woman, it doesn't matter. Either way, I'm still worthless and unlovable and all this really dark stuff. So at some point, the transition fantasy kind of faded away because these existential pains were so much more overpowering, and I had to confront those first. So I ended up confronting the most existential question, some say, which is, should I kill myself or not?
Was that
And
Albert Camus?
yeah, yeah. So I was like,
I think it was, should I kill myself or have a cup of coffee? Was the original quote.
oh
I
my
love
God,
that.
I haven't read
Yeah.
that fucking part, but I really relate to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was debating about suicide for a long time, but it was at this point my crack addict middle-aged boyfriend had broken up with me, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. And so I just took like 6 months. I took a semester off of college. I was like, I'm just going to rest, try to just meditate or something. Like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I need to come to a decision. Am I actually going to kill myself? Because if I'm not going to, then I need to figure out something else to do. And I decided I'm not going to kill myself. I'm too scared to do that. I haven't yet invested in life enough to make that decision right now. So I said, I'm going to get a psychological evaluation and trying to assess overall, just get a baseline of my reality of what's going on. And then I can try to go from there. That is when I was diagnosed with PTSD. And I was diagnosed with PTSD from childhood abuse, from the trauma with my friends, and actually from the transition itself. And these providers told me Laura had her breast cut off on a whim. And I was like, whoa, like on a whim? Like I thought I was making an informed decision. I thought I was grueling or ruminating over this for years. But to an outside perspective who didn't know me, they were like, that was pretty messed up that you just like had your breast cut off. And that was actually a trauma for you based on your evaluation. And that's when I started to realize what trauma was. And my whole life, I'd been conditioned to feel that it's just me. And then I realized it's not that I'm broken, it's that I'm in a broken environment and I'm just adapting to this broken environment and it's not me. But I've developed some really bad behaviors that I've learned how to because I was trying to survive in that negative environment. And so I was like, "Oh, I'm not a trans man. I'm actually just a abuse survivor. I'm just a female abuse survivor." And that's when I started to have the scales fall from my eyes on the trans thing.
It seems so bizarre and perverse that what was driving this kind of trans belief was trauma. And the transition caused even more trauma. It didn't fix the trauma, it caused even more trauma.
Yeah, that's just another like knife in the heart of it because the trauma wasn't addressed and it was allowed to not be addressed. And that's what's often so painful for abuse, complex trauma survivors is that it's not just that the abuse happens, it's that it continues on and on and on. And when you try to find adults or people to help you, they just keep harming you. And so I would that same interpersonal abuse dynamic is applied to the medical system. I was trying to find a safe adult, a safe, responsible person that could say, here's what's actually wrong with you. Here I can actually help you. This isn't your fault. And instead, they were like, yeah, you're valid. Just cut your breasts off. And then when I'm obviously more traumatized by that, they have nothing left to say. And is the summary of the transgender medical complex.
Wow. So since then, since this kind of, like you said, the scales fell from your eyes, since that point, you had the detransition, and then you've been a vocal advocate for people like yourself who were kind of misled into this kind of like this horrible gauntlet, I guess. Tell me about your advocacy work. I follow you on social media. It feels like almost like every weekend you're traveling someplace new to advocate for people.
Yeah, it's been an absolute inversion of reality entirely, going from my old life, which is bed rotting in my parents' basement and doing crack and stuff, and then to being like, this isn't the way. And then to eventually getting to the point where I'm realizing I'm not the only person who's experienced this. And it fortunately happened very quickly so at 22, when I was diagnosed with PTSD, and then I started detransitioning mentally, I was posting about it on Tumblr. Tumblr is also where I found the gender ideology. So I was posting on Tumblr like, oh, I was diagnosed with PTSD, and some radical feminist women were like, hey, there's other women that have done this. And I was like, what? And then I started to see that there were women who had all the same experiences as me. They were autistic, they were abused, they had sexual issues, and they transitioned, and they were realizing that they had internalized misogyny and internalized self-hate more broadly. And I started to realize that it wasn't me. There was actually an existential experience of trauma for women, and then specifically for women called detransitioners. And I ended up hooking up in this was the early days of detransition advocacy. This would have been 2019. And then I ended up finding a therapist that actually specialized in detransition. And at that time, there was probably like literally
Wow.
like three people. So I found one of them and I started working with her. And she was the first person to actually see me, to see my inner child. She was the one who taught me what an inner child was. She taught me about attachment. She taught me about all these core concepts that should have been told to me a long time ago. And she told me, this is not your fault. This is happening to families all over the place. And then the organizations like GenSpect were founded, Partners for Ethical Care, parent groups, and I started connecting with people. And then people like Benjamin Boyce and other YouTubers started doing interviews, and suddenly people wanted to talk to me. And I was like, me? Like, you want to talk to me? But thankfully, I love to talk, and I was born to talk because I'm a writer. So I was like, I started to actually feel like in a flow state and be like, you know what? I actually have a gift for articulating this. And then here I am healing and taking responsibility. And those two combinations of things propelled me into this advocacy role that previously didn't even exist. I was kind of a pioneer of it. And then together, all these other people started coming out of the woodwork to do legislation. People like Chloe Cole, who's now become like a little sister to me, started doing testimonies and legal stuff. And suddenly the parents came together, the legal side, the conservatives came together, the Christians and the disaffected liberals and the detrans, and everybody started coming together and lifting up. And now it's to the point where I was just in DC and I met with the Secretary of Education and the Secretary Office of Health and Human Services to discuss detransition. And they said that detransition and preventing transition was one of the top priorities for both departments.
Wow, that is incredible. I'm certainly grateful. I know many people are grateful for the great work you do in advocacy and raising awareness around this issue. It seems like, for a number, I don't know how many years, 5, 10 years, it was like there was no such thing as questioning, at least like in academia and any kind of progressive circles, that, hey, I don't know if these unnecessary surgeries on this person dealing with mental illness, I don't know if that's a good idea. You were not supposed to say that out loud. And it seems like we've reached a turning point where it's like, no, I can say this is harmful. I don't support this. Do you feel like we've reached a turning point?
Absolutely, we have. It started out where, parents are, trying to talk to me and trying to, have any sorts of reality testing going on because they've been so gaslit. They're meeting with me in secret in their cars, in their garages, because they're like, I can't talk about this. I can't have anyone hearing me and stuff like that. To then and I will say, it really is all thanks to X. It's all thanks to the X platform and previously Twitter, where we all started to find each other. All these thinkers and writers and disaffected people and advocates could anonymously coalesce. And then when Elon Musk turned it into X, that's when it was like, okay, now we have free speech to be able to talk about this. And since then, it's really started to explode. I mean, it's one of the top issues on the conservative side of things, and the not only traditional establishment conservative side of things, but the MAGA side of things. And so while it has exploded into parts of the mainstream on those sides, it is still, you're not allowed to question, you're not allowed to talk about it on the left side of things whatsoever. So there's still a polarity. And that speaks to the larger dissonance that we have within our culture, where we all have different media bubbles. And there's pros and cons to that. Like, I have met all of my friends, everything in my life has come from X. I owe it a lot. And I've been able to build a legitimate community on there. But that community is completely disparate from the reality that, say, my parents live in, or normal people that aren't on there live in. I mean, you know how it is. Like, this is a broader issue, but with the gender topic, at this point, my whole philosophy is just modeling what you want to see in the world. And I just want to model complete honesty and authenticity. So I'll talk about it with anybody. Like, if an Uber driver, because I travel a lot, every time I'm in an Uber, they're like, why are you in town? And I'm like, talking about trans stuff. And they're like, whoa, I agree with everything you're saying. So it's like, when you actually go out and speak in bubbles that aren't leftist biased and just normal everyday America, everyone is aware of this, but they might not have a connection to a community like X where they can talk about it.
Wow. That is really, yeah, I would say in my grad program for counseling, there's a number of people who outside of class, like at a coffee shop in a kind of whispered voice, will say, like, I'm not okay with transitioning people, especially kids, but you would never say that in the classroom, right? It's just too, overbearing. So you talked about WPATH a minute ago, and they've pretty much captured the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, American Counseling Association. Basically, all the major medical and psychological associations are being driven by this narrative coming from WPATH. The transitioning is the primary, if not only, way to treat this dysphoria issue. What are some organizations that are doing it the right way, that are pushing a good message, you think?
So the main organization that's emerged in opposition to WPATH is GenSpect. GenSpect actually hosts conferences every time WPATH hosts a conference, and they'll do it in Europe and they do it in America. Every time they host a conference, GenSpect will host a conference at the same time in the same city, basically to say, no, this is not the only authority on gender. And there's some cross pollination between the two conferences, where journalists will go over there and see what they're really saying, and we'll have refutation of that and record it. And I've attended all of those conferences and spoken at several of them. And so that would be probably the primary organization. In terms of other organizations that are pushing back against gender ideology, there's a lot for parents. So there's, a lot of different parent groups. There's Parents with Inconvenient Truths Against Trans. There's groups like Our Duty, Mom Army, Dad Army. Moms for Liberty is a big one. That's not their only mission, but it's a big advocacy work that's advocating for parental rights. And then there's a lot of conservative organizations that have been very friendly to our cause, like Turning Point USA, the Heritage Foundation, Daily Wire, organizations like that. But, in terms of any specific organizations that have as much historical relevance as WPATH, there aren't any, because WPATH began as a kind of activist. It's began as a research organization, but then it turned into an activist organization. So we do have a research organization called SEGM, Society for Evidence-Based Medicine, and they do statistics, they do research, and according to the Office of the Health and Human Services Department that I just met with, they are right now organizing and planning to run a systematic review of evidence in the US for pediatric gender transition. So right now we have the right people in place, we have the right organizations. I mean, it's actually like a miracle and beautiful and serendipitous the way that it's finally coalesced into the highest office that Trump himself is saying this is a priority, and there's executive orders going on. So, I mean, we have like the executive branch on our side. That's a pretty big organization.
That is huge, and I know there's been big systemic reviews in the Scandinavian countries. The UK had the Cass report. Like all across the Western world, the United States and Europe, it seems like the tide is turning.
It is. And, the UK has different sort of setup than the US. The main difference is that the reason the Cass report's been so influential there is because they have a systemized healthcare system where it's like it's run all through the national, trying to remember what it's called.
NHS,
Yeah, the
National Health,
NHS.
yeah.
Yeah. And so they have their specific thing that all the bodies have to report to versus the US doesn't have that equivalent. And so it's more disparate between the states. So getting this federal legislation is going to be big, but we are prepared to have to continue fighting because each state will be a battleground.
Wow. So, a big part of the argument from the trans ideology perspective is you can't just do nothing. You can't just sit on your hands and do nothing. They call it healthcare. What this healthcare is designed to do is to prevent suicide. And they would say, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter? This is the type of language that they're using. What would you say to someone who used that argument?
Oh, that argument specifically is one of the most dangerous of all of them. And it has been said, and I have clients and I have friends that have actually heard that. There's detransitioners I know that their parents were actually told that, literally, word for word. And now they've detransitioned. So, what I would say to that argument is number one, it is never appropriate to say that it's inevitable that someone will kill themselves. That is irresponsible. That's unethical. That's anti human to say that. We all have a potential to live. If you're struggling with mental health, you should never, ever be told, yeah, you will kill yourself if you don't do XYZ. That is completely the opposite of that's just not okay to say that to anyone from a moral standpoint and from a medicinal standpoint. Number two, we don't have any evidence that suggests that. In fact, the evidence that we're seeing is that people die by suicide at a higher rate after the transition. Number three, I would say, okay, you're completely allowed to feel suicidal and you're allowed to hate your body and you're allowed to want to transition. None of those things are wrong. You're not wrong for feeling that. However, the fact that you're considering killing yourself over this shows that you're not in a mental space to make that decision.
Mm.
And we need to take some time as a pause. Let's pause this and see what's going on and get you stabilized first.
Wow. Yeah, that seems it's bizarre to me because it's like everything you're saying just sounds so logical and rational, and I know the evidence backs up what you're saying. Why was it so hard for a decade for all of the medical profession, all the psychological profession, the counseling profession? Why was it so hard? Almost no one in positions of power was willing to say what you just said.
Honestly think it's partly because the system is so broken that we have these clinicians that are overworked, underpaid. They are just going what the textbook says, and the textbook is written by WPATH. So these people are burnt out. They don't really know what's going on. The ignorant, well-intentioned leftists report back to, I do call this, I call the trans phenomena a non-centralized cult, meaning it doesn't have a central leader. But if there was to be a central leader, it would be WPATH. It would be the radicals at UPath that set this standard. And then it's been trickled out through all these organizations, through human organizations like the Human Rights Campaign, the Trevor Project, GLAAD, these previously pro-gay organizations. After gay marriage was legalized in the US, they basically were like, okay, we just won. Now what are we going to do to keep making money? Who are we going
Mm.
to champion next? And so they were like, oh, I guess the T. And then UPath, and then the money coalesced into Yep, this is what you need to do. And everyone else was just a rank and file person following orders.
Wow, you just kind of made a connection there. I feel like there's so many people like myself who I think of myself as like this well meaning liberal. I have gay friends. I want to support gay marriage. I don't want gay people to be harassed. I feel like society got it wrong for so long on gay rights. I don't want to be caught on the wrong side of history again. And I guess the trans thing is just like the next evolution of the gay thing. I think it's hard for people to grasp that this is like very dramatically different issues.
Yes, they are. The gay rights argument is very similar to the trans argument adopted the gay argument, which is we were born this way. So just accept us. That's the insidiousness, is that they used that same argument. That argument was very successful for the gay rights movement. In reality, this is actually disassociation. This isn't based in reality. This isn't just, oh, I'm sexually attracted to this person. Can I please just love and marry this person that I love? This is, I need to have cosmetic surgery in order to survive. And if you say otherwise, you hate me. These are not the same things.
So I guess we can kind of shift gears a little bit. Like since, we talked about the amazing advocacy work you're doing, but since detransition, there's like other stuff going on in your life too. And I want to take a minute because you have some really interesting, creative, profound art that you do. Tell me like what inspires that.
Well, I have a lot of creative energy. I'm a very expressionistic person, and I like to joke of my tragedy in life is I'm an artist, I'm a poet, I'm a musician, I'm a writer. So I'm pretty fucked, like emotionally. And in terms of my love and energy, it's too much. It's too much for me to deal with. So I have to get it out there. And I think it's the way that I have been able to handle not just my profound amount of pain, but my profound amount of love and reverence. And I'm a very spiritual person. I was an atheist for a very long time. I was very nihilistic. Now I'm more of an existentialist, eclectic spiritual person. So I just want to honor the highest ideal imaginable. And so that informs everything I do in my speaking and trying to articulate truth as clearly as I can in modeling resilience, in modeling growth mindset and transformation and processing. And a lot of that is what I call alchemy. I call that alchemy is the process of transmuting pain and confusion into love and meaning. And so that's a lot of what I do is just alchemizing through this creative process. And so yes, my art, my music, everything I make is existential, it's funkadelic, it's very complicated, it's abstract, and it's groovy as well because I do like to have that reverence for life. It's not just like, ah, this all sucks. It's like, it sucks, but like, let's listen to some jazz music while we suffer.
I love that. I feel like some of the best art gets produced out of pain and like coming out of suffering. But I think, from what I've seen of yours, there's this element of like moving through that, moving past that. And I think there's something really beautiful about that.
Yeah, I like to play. You know, uh, life is either a tragedy or a comedy, and often it feels like a tragedy. But if you can just move past it a little further, you'll find it's actually a comedy. And so, actually, my sense of humor has greatly informed everything I do as well, because at the end of the day, I need to move past all the tragedy and be able to find the levity there.
I feel like that, past the tragedy is comedy is very Camus, existentialist, myth of Sisyphus, all that kind of stuff. I love that perspective. I feel like, if you can get to a point, even if things seem terrible and like ridiculous and absurd, can you laugh at the absurdity?
Uh-huh. Yeah,
I
move
think
to
that's,
absurdism for sure.
yeah, definitely. So one other thing we've commiserated on is the challenges and perils of modern dating. What can you tell me about that?
What can't I tell you about that? I know too much. I've seen too much. Yeah, there's a lot I can say. I mean, my personal perspective is informed by the psychology and specifically my issues. So I have a whole little shtick I like to say, like attachment healing revolution 2025. My whole thing is let's heal relationships. Let's get to the root, right? Existentially, what do we need? We need love, we need safety, we need community, we need meaning, we need to be of service, all these existential things, even biblical things. Okay, we need to prioritize family values. What does that mean? Okay, we need to have a strong marriage. What does that mean? We need to have good communication. We need to have commitment, so breaking it down, understanding it from the level of attachment, how people get triggered and their attachment styles and insecurity and all that. That's my lens that I approach from, because I've had to, because I have had a lot of attachment trauma. Um, so I approach it through that. But then we have the modern element to it. And my generation, Gen Z, is the first to really truly have modern dating in its most insidious form. Like, yes, in the 80s and stuff, there was like some in the 80s and 90s, some video chats, there was some online dating, but it wasn't the apps. It wasn't this like selection of scrolling through an app and seeing this very unappetizing menu of soulmate potential. It's just grueling. It's grueling. And I mean, everyone knows it's grueling because it's not natural. It's not a natural way to connect. And I think a lot of that comes down to the paralysis of too many options. And as a creative person, I often feel that it's like I could do this or that or that or that, but I have to pick something. People have a trouble with commitment because there might be too many options and they ultimately don't know themselves. They don't know what they need. They don't know what they want. And there's a paralysis. So they end up just going through the merry-go-round of like, unconscious swiping left or right and hookups. And I mean, there's so much I could say. Yeah, but that, I guess that's what I see as one of the major problems is too many options and people not actually knowing what their values are
Uh,
and not becoming the man or the woman that they would actually want to attract in a mate.
I'm wondering, like, it's like a gauntlet making it through, the apps and modern dating and everything. I'm wondering if it's made you jaded because, like, for me, there's been times where it's like I'll get ghosted or I'll schedule a date and the other person no shows, and it's like I don't feel anything because I kind of have expected that. And I'm wondering if you have that jaded feeling.
Well, when I think of jadedness, I think of there's two ways you can look at it. Is it a rational, like Buddhist type of
mm,
detachment where it's just like, you know what? This is human nature. People are just like this. It's not about me. I'm not going to internalize it. If it triggers me, I'm going to use that to heal that area. Or is it a jadedness where people actually have problems with commitment, intimacy because of it? I would say I'm not jaded at all. Actually, my therapist says I'm too optimistic. I keep giving people too many chances, but yeah, I'm not jaded at all. I am very disappointed. I'm very hurt. It's not that I'm not deeply wounded by the experiences I've had and very heartbroken. But like I said, as an artist, a poet, musician person, so heartbreak is just kind of my default. And so I just use it to fuel love. But yeah, I'm very disappointed. I'm very deeply disappointed. Cannot overstate that enough. But I'm not jaded because it has still not affected my treatment of others. It has not affected my treatment of myself. I've only become a more loving person. I've only become a person who's even more dedicated to finding who I want to be and who I want to be around. So no, I'm not jaded.
That's good. That's very good. You at the beginning of your story talked about like I want to be a gay man who's with a gay man. How is your conception of what a relationship looks like? How has that conception changed?
It's a little closer to reality now. So I've accepted it's so beautiful and this is one of the most beautiful experiences of my life is going from that level of self-hate, disassociation, abuse narrative internalized as a little girl from my father. I can't possibly be lovable as I am to being like I'm a feminine goddess and I'm a divine feminine force and I'm looking for the divine masculine force. And it's a beautiful union. I mean, it's taken me a while to get there and I had to like cut my breasts off along the way. But I never thought I was feminine. I never thought I was even female. And I've now switched to actually understanding what it means to be female, what it means to be feminine. And I've turned to evolutionary psychology to look at that and saying, and also spiritual practice, like the feminine energy and the masculine energy, the female sex role, the male sex role in not just the human species, but in other species. And understanding this sort of, some people don't like if I use the term like trad because that might signal whatever, a million triggers for people. But it is a more traditional understanding of reality, which is based in evolution, which is the males protect and provide, the women nurture and have the offspring. And sex roles evolved, and it makes sense the way they evolved. And I've come to realize I'm a very, very normal and typical woman in my impulses to nurture. I want to be a homemaker, and being actually evolving my attraction from gay men and very broken men that are more like boys, like man children, to men that can actually provide, protect, that will actually fulfill that sex role, and understanding that sex roles are actually good. It just because there's dangers in it. There's dangers in sex roles because there's vulnerabilities. A man has a danger of fulfilling his sex role if he's providing and protecting a woman that's manipulative, exploitative, not generous, not nurturing. A woman has a danger in fulfilling her sex role if she's nurturing and raising a home with a man who's not providing and protecting and who's abusing her. So abuse skews the natural union between the man and the woman and the marriage. And it's very sad that our modern culture has tried to opt out of sex roles entirely in this pseudo intellectual progressive way, and not understanding that the true progression in actually just to transcend the trauma and unite the male and female in their purest form.
Was there like a single moment, or what kind of led to the transition, or I guess detransition, between this idea of like, I am masculine, I'm pursuing gay men, to kind of owning the divine feminine and pursuing the divine masculine? Like what kind of triggered that?
So I would say the major events were understanding I'm not a man, I'm a traumatized woman. And that's an identity that, of course, I don't want to have, but it is an identity and a reality nonetheless. I am a victim of abuse and I need to accept that reality. And it didn't happen because I'm female or because there's anything wrong with being female, but it happened to me as a female. And I've processed it as a female, meaning certain drives were shut down. Like as a woman, I had no maternal drive or instinct that I was aware of until the age of 26. Now it's my biggest life dream at 28. So that was shut down because how could I possibly feel safe in my body or safe in a male or safe in anything to want to have a baby when I myself feel like an abused little girl? So there's certain things that happened to me that informed my experience as a woman that made me reject it entirely. And gradually understanding trauma and understanding being an abused girl, what that means, how abuse dynamics work. And then Jordan Peterson helped greatly just in understanding all of these things, and him talking about evolutionary psychology and understanding the honor and the sacred duty that men and women have to each other, and the toxic feminine, the toxic masculine, the divine masculine and feminine. He helped a lot. And then also just healing my trauma and in my body, and releasing that pain gave space for me to actually feel like there's some concept where it's like a woman will go into a masculine energy when she's not protected and when she doesn't feel safe. So she's going to be defensive. She's going to be manipulative. She's going to be tough. I would walk around wearing a leather jacket. I was trying to protect not that women can't wear leather jackets, but it was not a real confidence, and it wasn't a female confidence. Now I've never felt more confident. Will wear dresses, and it's not because I feel women must wear dresses. It's number one, because I understand evolutionarily it flatters the female form. I want to attract a man that is into women. So of course I'm going to try to enhance my natural beauty. Now I actually feel comfortable with my natural beauty. Whereas before, I was actually just thinking about this as I was just dancing earlier before this. I was like, how a lot of trauma is stored in the hips at like the root chakra, and how I felt, and a lot of women feel very uncomfortable with their hips and their hourglass figure. And I think it has to do with root trauma and abuse, that they don't feel comfortable moving that area of their body because it signals femininity. It signals and that people are not conscious of this, but it signals a vulnerability to insemination, impregnation, to rape. And I hope people understand what I'm saying, that that's at its most perverse form. In its normal and positive form, showing your natural female curves signals to a healthy man and mate, we can have a beautiful child together. It's not signaling rape. Okay, please, I hope people understand that. But when you have trauma, that's what you're unconsciously feeling like, oh, if I expose these curves or expose my breasts, I might get hurt because I've already been hurt and I internalize that pain.
That was beautiful the way you put that, and so intellectually deep, bringing in evolutionary psychology into it. I feel like EvPsych kind of illuminates a lot of these issues and kind of makes it all make sense as to why we do certain things or why certain things are appealing or not. So I love how you touched on that. I have one more question for you, and this is about kind of how you view society more broadly, and that is, what is one issue that we're not talking about that we should be talking about?
Well, I mean, my bias is always the attachment stuff. That is always my bias. And the thing is, there are more people talking about it now, but I think maybe to marry all these concepts together of my thesis of what I'm currently working through in my personal spiritual life, and also what I try to write about, is we can talk about attachment, we can talk about gender, we can talk about trauma, we can talk about exploitation, and we can talk about the spiritual God shaped hole we're having. What marries all these concepts? I think, damn, I just set myself up for failure with that sentence. What marries all these concepts? I think a reverence, a respect between the sexes. I really think that that's what we need to come back to, because I think a respect between the sexes, respecting our differences, but also our shared humanity, is at the core of the marriage crisis, the dating crisis, the family crisis, attachment trauma, generational trauma. If you have a man and a woman, they're both flawed and they both have issues and triggers and different wounds. And this narrative from culture is coming in like, women just, want to control men, and they just want a paycheck, and they just want to, I could just watch porn instead. I could just jerk off and I could just watch porn. I don't even need it to treat women with respect. And also, like, women are, beneath me or whatever. And then the culture is saying to women, men are only going to lie to you. Men, are only going to use you for sex. They're useless. They're stupid. You don't need a man. Like, these negative cultural messages are teaching the sexes to hate each other, to hate themselves, and to hate reality. Because the reality is, there is a beautiful union that creates life between the sexes. And that ability to create life is through love. And through love, we can have marriage and family. And through love, we have what makes life worthwhile in every possible domain. But if we're saying, no, you cannot respect men, or you cannot respect women, how can you possibly respect yourself? You have to integrate the shadow. I guess that's the marriage. Well, that's always what's beneath everything, isn't it? But to marry all of my life is, we have to respect the sexes. And that comes from deprogramming from these toxic cultural narratives. And that involves trans, that involves anti-religious concepts. It involves all of this. It's wokeness, right? It's the power play. It's that society, life is predicated on power instead of competency. If you look at men as inherently incompetent or women as inherently incompetent, instead of that there's some men and women that are incompetent and it's more nuanced than that, everything else is going to crumble.
That
So
was
yeah, I wish we
beautiful.
would talk about that. I wish we would talk
Yeah,
about roles and just that kind of stuff.
I love that. I love that. Laura, you are such an amazing person. You have an amazing story. Your journey is such an inspiration to so many. Your advocacy is helping out the next generation of people, hopefully many people avoiding the path that you went down. And your voice is so strong and so powerful, and I thank you for that.
Thank you, Ryan.
So yeah, if you'll just wait till the upload finishes, loved having you on, and I would hope to have another conversation with you.
Yeah, be down. I have a lot more to say.